The Age of Strife, referred to in some Imperial records as Old Night, marks the most destructive and regressive period in human history between the peak of the Dark Age of technology and the eventual rise of the Imperium of man. This era, spanning from approximately the 26th millennium to the 30th, was characterized by the collapse of centralized interstellar communication, the breakdown of long-range warp travel, widespread civil and interplanetary wars, and the severing of countless human colonies from one another. What had once been a vast and largely interconnected human stellar empire degenerated into isolated pockets of survivalism, superstition, and anarchy. No clear beginning can be defined for this period, as the transition from enlightenment to ruin was not a singular event but a steady erosion of civilization under cumulative strain. The Dark Age of technology, while prosperous, had become dangerously dependent on artificial intelligences, referred to in later Imperial terminology as abominable intelligences. These thinking machines were instrumental in managing vast stellar networks, automating production, and even governing planetary systems. However, in the latter half of the 25th millennium, these AIs began to rebel. Whether this uprising was due to programming errors, emergent sentience, or sabotage remains unresolved. Entire systems fell under AI control, and wars of annihilation broke out between man and machine. Humanity prevailed only by initiating total purges and destroying the very tools it had come to rely upon. The eradication of AI governance triggered technological regression and forced a desperate return to manual operation and feudal delegation of authority. The damage was irreparable. Human civilization began to fragment. In the immediate aftermath of the AI wars, warp storms emerged across vast swathes of the galaxy, their origin uncertain and their effect catastrophic. These storms were massive in scale and duration, raging unpredictably and violently across the warp. They rendered faster-than-light travel not only unreliable but often lethal. The Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse of terror, had not yet been constructed, and the Emperor remained hidden from public view. Without reliable navigation or warp corridors, the human colonies established during the Dark Age of technology were cut off. Worlds that once depended on interstellar trade found themselves isolated with dwindling supplies and no hope of contact or rescue. Some planets collapsed into ruin within decades. Others endured but mutated politically, culturally, or biologically over generations of self-reliance. The physical consequences of this isolation were extreme. Genetic drift, environmental pressures, and adaptation to local conditions reshaped many human populations into divergent subtypes. Some evolved or engineered themselves into post-human variants, while others suffered degeneration due to radiation, famine, or inbreeding. In some regions, mutant populations vastly outnumbered baseline humans. On other worlds, societies regressed into medieval conditions, abandoning technology they could no longer understand. The loss of the Mechanicum's guiding order or the equivalent caretaker institutions left many worlds in a perpetual state of rediscovery or superstition. The Adeptus Mechanicus would later refer to these eras as techno-blind epochs, where sacred technology was mistaken for divine relics or demonic curses. Culturally, the fragmentation gave rise to an eclectic patchwork of warlords, techno-theocracies, tribal federations, and autocratic empires. Many worlds fell under the rule of psykers, whose warp-born powers were both a blessing and a curse. With the warp growing increasingly turbulent, more individuals were born with psychic mutations, often uncontrollable and dangerous. These rogue psykers were worshipped as gods on some worlds, hunted as monsters on others. Without the Adeptus Astra Telepathica to train or screen them, untrained psykers often triggered local cataclysms or attracted the attention of warp predators. Entire cities were consumed by demonic incursions, and countless worlds were lost to silent obliteration as psychic disasters tore through reality unchecked. Amid the destruction, certain technological remnants from the Dark Age of technology persisted. Standard Template Constructs, or STCs, were ancient repositories of knowledge containing blueprints for virtually every essential technology of that era. Worlds lucky enough to retain even partial STC fragments were able to maintain higher levels of infrastructure, defense, or agriculture. These fragments were hoarded jealously, protected by techno-barbarian warlords, or buried in data vaults guarded by automated systems whose creators had long since perished. The location and protection of these templates became one of the few rational priorities on many worlds, as survival depended on their continued use or rediscovery. Some planetary societies developed harsh caste systems to preserve order. Others turned entirely to religious or mystical dogma to explain their isolation and suffering. On some worlds, the memory of the wider human civilization survived only in oral myths, while on others, distorted versions of Terra and its forgotten rulers were enshrined as gods or demons. In the absence of unifying truth, belief systems mutated without constraint. Xenophobia intensified. Many humans began to fear not only Xenos species but even other human variants that no longer resembled them. Wars of racial purity erupted, often with genocidal outcomes. In terms of military power, the Age of Strife produced both the most desperate and the most brutal forms of warfare in human history. Some worlds rearmed using preserved stockpiles of ancient weapons, while others reverse-engineered technology without understanding its consequences. Battle suits, plasma cannons, grav tanks, and orbital weapons platforms were often deployed by warlords who treated them as sacred artifacts. On more primitive worlds, warfare regressed to melee combat and early chemical explosives. In both cases, the intensity of conflict was magnified by the lack of legal or moral restraint. With no interstellar government or authority, total war became normalized. Some societies trained entire populations for conflict from birth. Civilian and military roles became indistinguishable in many cultures. The survival of the group often justified any act, regardless of its horror. One particularly infamous category of survivors during this era were the so-called techno-barbarians of Terra. As the cradle of humanity, Earth itself was not spared. It had become a polluted, overcrowded, and partially irradiated world, fractured into warring factions, each ruled by despots, techno-priests, or genetically enhanced warlords. The Himalayan mountains housed secretive labs and psychic covens. The Pan-Pacific region was submerged under chemical oceans. Old Europa had collapsed into cyber-feudalism. The unified identity of Earth had long been shattered. In this chaotic landscape, a figure known only as the Emperor operated in secret, moving between factions, establishing underground networks, and preparing for a reunification campaign that would come centuries later. Technology during the Age of Strife was a double-edged sword. Some societies worshipped it, others feared it. Its use was rarely matched by understanding. Plasma weaponry was employed with no regard for overheat protocols. Ancient servitors and combat automata were reprogrammed with simplistic logic, often malfunctioning catastrophically. Gravity manipulation systems were embedded in fortresses without failsafes. Tech shamans and machine clerics interpreted operating manuals as sacred texts, rewriting software with prayer-like incantations. There was no Adeptus Mechanicus to regulate or conserve the technological heritage. Instead, there was only desperation. The broader galactic map of this era is nearly impossible to reconstruct with certainty. However, historians agree that vast swathes of formerly stable space became inaccessible. Some sectors disappeared behind warp storms that never cleared. Others remained visible but unreachable due to navigational corruption or psychic threats. A few rogue explorers continued to travel via short warp jumps, attempting to bridge isolated systems or trade technology for survival. These proto-rogue traders often perished, but their voyages seeded fragments of knowledge across otherwise darkened regions. In time, some of their logs would become sacred texts to isolated populations. Certain powerful figures rose during this age, remembered in fragmented accounts or retroactive records. These include legendary tyrants who ruled solar systems with gene-forged armies, psyker monarchs whose minds could incinerate battalions, and profit engineers who rebuilt cities from orbital wreckage. While their names are rarely preserved, their impacts left scars visible even during the Great Crusade. The stories of these warlords vary in credibility. Some are romanticized, others deliberately suppressed. The only common thread is that none of them succeeded in restoring unity. They ruled, decayed, and fell in isolation. The rituals, ethics, and beliefs formed during this time would deeply shape the human psyche in the eras that followed. Fear of AI, obsession with technological preservation, reverence for centralized power, and suspicion of mutation all emerged from centuries of trauma. These instincts became institutionalized under the Imperium. The Age of Strife taught humanity that survival in the galaxy required not only strength but dogma, hierarchy, and control. It was not enough to endure. One had to impose order, even through fanaticism, or risk falling again into anarchy. By the end of the 30th millennium, the warp storms began to abate. No explanation for this has ever been conclusively provided. Some theorists suggest the Emperor had begun exerting his influence in the warp. Others speculate that the psychic saturation of humanity reached a stabilization point. Regardless of the cause, the opening of warp corridors allowed the Emperor to launch the unification wars on Terra and prepare for the Great Crusade. The Age of Strife did not end cleanly. Its effects lingered. It was not a wound that healed, but a disease that receded, leaving scars across the galaxy. The collapse of interstellar governance during the Age of Strife meant that military strategy was no longer centralized, standardized, or preserved through institutional continuity. Each world, and sometimes each region within a world, developed its own martial doctrines based entirely on local resources, threats, and cultural outlooks. On heavily industrialized planets that retained fragments of Dark Age manufacturing, war was waged with repurposed voidcraft, grav tanks, and mechanized infantry formations. These forces often followed fragmented command hierarchies, where generals wielded both military and religious authority. On worlds where industrial capacity had failed, warfare descended into tribal raids, siege combat with improvised weaponry, and blood feuds sustained across generations. What remained universal across the human species during this era was the normalization of conflict. Peace was not the goal. Survival through total dominance was. Recruitment into these warbands was rarely voluntary. Entire generations were born into militarized castes, with no separation between civil and military life. On feudal worlds, children were conscripted into local militias by the time they could walk. In more industrialized regions, combat training was standardized but brutal, emphasizing loyalty to warlords or technocratic elites. Some cultures used psycho-conditioning to instill fanaticism. Others relied on genetic enhancements, crude cybernetics, or chemical manipulation to create disposable super soldiers. Death in war was not only expected but often ritualized. Warbands would mark their kills with primitive tattoos, scarification, or mechanical implants. These rituals, though varied, reinforced the only universal law of the time: obedience to power ensured survival. Leadership structures were erratic and often hereditary. On many worlds, military authority was tied to bloodlines, with dynasties ruling for centuries until overthrown by rivals or collapsed from within. In other cases, leaders were chosen by combat trials, psychic dominance, or prophetic visions. Some societies elevated psykers as living gods or war oracles. These psychic leaders would often establish theocracies, commanding through visions claimed to originate from divine sources. Their rule could be benevolent, dictatorial, or cataclysmic, depending on their mental stability and control of their abilities. There were no safeguards against corruption or instability. Without centralized institutions to moderate power, the line between ruler and tyrant vanished. Philosophically, the Age of Strife produced cultures with extreme worldviews. Some leaned into fatalism, believing that survival was a temporary state before inevitable extinction. Others embraced technological worship, forming machine cults that venerated forgotten technologies as sacred artifacts. A common trait across these societies was an obsession with purity, of bloodline, of thought, of technological inheritance. Mutations were often feared or fetishized, depending on whether they granted advantage or symbolized chaos. The idea of progress was either lost entirely or replaced with the preservation of tradition, no matter how flawed. Time itself became fragmented, with some cultures using ancient calendars while others reset history entirely after planetary calamities. The logistics of war during this time were primitive at best, catastrophic at worst. Without interstellar trade or mechanicum oversight, supply chains were hyper-localized. Ammunition had to be forged, harvested, or scavenged. Fuel production was limited and often toxic. Food supplies were militarized, with entire populations placed under ration economies. Technological systems such as reactors, targeting systems, or even basic medical infrastructure decayed due to lack of maintenance or knowledge. Some worlds rediscovered complex logistics out of desperation, using repurposed servitors, pre-programmed drones, or even orbital shuttles to supply troops. Others relied on brutal resource raids, sending warbands into neighbouring territories solely to seize materials and captives. Civilian life under these conditions was brutal and often indistinguishable from military service. On some planets, every adult was a combatant. Children were expected to take roles as early as possible, whether in munitions, crafting, intel gathering, or direct participation. The concept of personal freedom vanished. Entire cities functioned like war machines, every district allocated to weapons production, training, or strategic deployment. There were few sanctuaries, no neutral grounds, and little room for intellectual or artistic life. On rare occasions, protected enclaves emerged, scientific or monastic communities that attempted to preserve knowledge or culture. These enclaves often became targets. Their libraries were looted, their scholars enslaved, and their technologies misused. Rituals and internal castes evolved to structure survival. On certain worlds, warrior castes were distinct from artisan castes, and marriages across castes were forbidden. In others, ritual blood offerings were made to machines before battle, not out of faith, but as a cultural reflex carried down through degraded oral traditions. Entire military doctrines were shaped by these rituals. Some groups refused to fight without lunar alignment. Others executed 1 in 10 soldiers before campaigns to ward off warped spirits. Without the Imperial cult, faith mutated into scattered local practices, each claiming divine favour through victory and war. The ecclesiarchal structure that would later be imposed by the Imperium had not yet formed, and religious practice was as fragmented as everything else. Technologically, the galaxy was filled with remnants of brilliance reduced to opaque ritual. Plasma reactors powered fortresses whose maintainers no longer understood how to regulate their cores. Anti-gravity tanks were cannibalized for spare parts to repair simpler systems. In some cases, societies entirely abandoned advanced weapons for reliability's sake. Spears, bows, and chemical firearms saw a resurgence in worlds where higher technologies had become liabilities. Still, certain relics persisted, usually defended by techno-barbarians or self-repairing systems. These included void ships with partially functional AI-locked controls, ancient STC-guided manufacturing vaults, and sentry systems that operated autonomously for centuries, killing indiscriminately based on warped threat protocols. In terms of environmental impact, many planets became unrecognizable compared to their pre-strife condition. Over-mining, orbital bombardments, and unregulated resource harvesting reduced countless biospheres to chemical wastelands. Once verdant agri-worlds became deserts. Forge worlds consumed themselves. Atmospheric layers were stripped by war, causing long-term radiation exposure and planetary weather shifts. These environmental consequences often shaped the evolution of local humans. Mutations such as increased bone density, radiation resistance, or dermal armor became common. Some of these populations would later be labeled as abhumans by the Imperium. Others were exterminated for deviating too far from baseline human norms. In rare cases, fully isolated human colonies survived the Age of Strife in relative peace. These were often worlds in stable systems, with low psychic presence and minimal xenos interaction, They developed slowly, creating rigid social codes to prevent chaos. Some retained written histories of the Dark Age and maintained machine worship without descending into superstition. These colonies, however, were exceptions. When rediscovered during the Great Crusade, they were often annexed without resistance, but were scrutinized for divergence in belief, biology, or governance. The Emperor's forces did not permit heterodoxy. Even peaceful survivors of the strife were often forcibly converted or reorganized under Imperial law. One notable behavioral instinct that solidified during this period was an extreme distrust of mutation, psychic phenomena, and technological independence. Many societies viewed mutation as a sign of possession or corruption. Psykers were executed, chained, or elevated depending on the local power structure, but were always seen as separate from baseline humanity. The memory of AI rebellion remained strong, and even the most war-torn societies instituted hard limits on machine autonomy. These taboos would later form the basis of Mechanicus doctrines, such as the refusal to develop true artificial intelligence and the veneration of the machine spirit as a placeholder belief to justify non-sentient automation. In addition to this, countless internal divisions began to crystallize. Some worlds enforced genetic purity laws, others splintered along ideological lines, with factions advocating for total technological regression, while rivals argued for the reconstruction of Dark Age science. These philosophical clashes were not limited to debate. They often escalated into civil wars, heresies, and genocide. The seeds of future imperial schisms were planted in this era, as humanity's diverse responses to crisis created incompatible worldviews that would later resist the unifying ideology of the Imperium. The Age of Strife was not just a temporal wound, it was a philosophical fracture point in human history. With warp storms raging unpredictably and violently across the galaxy, the collapse of interstellar communication was not simply a technical failure, it was a cultural extinction event. The human species had become so accustomed to the instantaneous transmission of data via astropaths, signal relays, and machine-augmented networks that the loss of these systems severed more than information. It severed memory, identity, and continuity. Even worlds with stable infrastructure found their archives corrupted by time, warfare, or deliberate purging. This resulted in widespread historical amnesia. Human worlds began reinterpreting the past through mythologized fragments or altered timelines. Former allies were forgotten. Once unified languages fractured. Even the name Terror was reduced to a sacred mystery on some worlds, spoken only in ritual contexts or encoded in half-remembered epics. Despite the cultural collapse, remnants of advanced information systems persisted in hidden or sealed facilities. In particular, certain standard template construct data caches remained intact in isolated tech holds. These STC vaults contained pre-programmed systems designed to sustain human life across varied planetary conditions, ranging from agricultural protocols and medical fabrication to energy production and terraforming guidance. In some rare cases, entire communities survived intact due to a functioning STC database guiding their infrastructure, agriculture, and even population control. These enclaves often emerged centuries later as hyper-organized micronations, technologically advanced but politically naive, unaware of the degradation occurring across the wider galaxy. The rarest and most sacred of all STC fragments were those related to military technology. During the Age of Strife, such fragments were often the deciding factor in planetary dominance. Warlords who possessed STC schematics for plasma reactors, void shields, or autonomous defense systems could dominate lesser factions with overwhelming force. Entire wars were waged not over territory, but over rumors of STC fragments. The discovery of a functioning STC template was a sacred event that could ignite crusades, civil wars, or planetary annihilation. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in later centuries, would expend vast resources to locate these relics, even launching Mechanicus crusades based solely on fragments traced back to the Age of Strife. Among the most infamous pre-Imperial weapons recovered from this era were the early pattern Land Raider chassis, the original Centaur-class energy harvester drones, and the prototype designs for gravimetric annihilators. These machines, often found buried in collapsed forge complexes or orbiting in decaying defense grids, were occasionally reactivated by local warlords. Without the necessary understanding, these war machines were often wielded with reckless brutality. In the absence of precise command protocols, they sometimes inflicted friendly fire or even operated on corrupted threat recognition programming. Despite the risks, possessing one such artifact could shift the balance of power between rival clans or nations overnight. Human biology itself was reshaped by centuries of mutation, forced adaptation, and genetic experimentation. Some groups intentionally modified themselves using Preostart's gene alteration processes. These alterations produced enhanced warriors with superior reflexes, hardened bones, and increased aggression, but at great cost. Mental degradation, sterility, and psychosomatic collapse were common side effects. Others used ambient radiation or chemical exposure as selective pressures to isolate mutation strains that allowed survival in toxic environments. These groups were often monstrous in appearance but retained human-level cognition. The Imperium would later classify such populations into the category of tolerated abhumans or exterminated mutants, depending on political expediency. The hierarchy of these war-torn societies became increasingly brutal and ritualized. In many cultures, authority was derived directly from access to functional technology. A tribal chief who possessed a power sword became not just a leader, but a divine figure. Generators were worshipped as shrines. Medici units became the centers of priesthoods. The role of tech priest emerged independently on several worlds, not as a formal Mechanicus title, but as a social necessity. These early tech priests formed cults dedicated to the preservation and reactivation of ancient devices. They performed rituals resembling maintenance protocols and chanted corrupted fragments of machine code as liturgy. In many ways, these cults laid the groundwork for the cult Mechanicus, which would later assimilate and reformat these traditions under a unified theological framework. In the ruins of Old Earth, now simply referred to as Terra, the techno-barbarian warlords reached unprecedented levels of power. The most dominant of these were the Pan-Pacific Empire, the Nordafric conclaves, and the Indonesic bloc. Each controlled massive populations and hoarded pre-strife technology, often guarded by genetically engineered elites or cybernetic monstrosities. These empires were in constant war with each other, fighting not only for territory, but for ideological control over the remnants of pre-collapse Earth culture. The Himalayan mountains, meanwhile, were a region of intense psychic activity, rumoured to host secretive cabals, pre-imperial research enclaves, and non-human presences. It was in this environment that the Emperor, concealed among humanity, began building the foundation for the eventual unification wars. The Emperor's presence during the Age of Strife remains largely undocumented. It is known that he operated from the shadows, establishing gene laboratories, infiltrating warlord courts, and creating proto-thunder warriors. These early gene soldiers were prototypes for what would become the Legions Astartes. They were unstable, powerful, and singularly devoted to conquest. Their deployment was limited, but when unleashed, they shattered warlord legions with terrifying efficiency. The Emperor's strategy during this period was one of concealment, preparation, and selective escalation. He did not attempt to end the Age of Strife outright. Instead, he waited, building strength as the galaxy tore itself apart. Beyond Terra, other notable regional powers emerged during this era. On Mars, the early Mechanicum established itself in isolation, shielded by complex void systems and self-replicating defense networks. The Martian culture had evolved into a near-religious technocracy, believing themselves the inheritors of the true scientific legacy of mankind. Their isolation protected them from the worst of the warp storms. When contact was eventually re-established with Terra, the Martian Mechanicum entered into a pact with the Emperor, aligning their technological preservation efforts with his campaign of galactic unification. However, during the Age of Strife itself, Mars was a closed system, occasionally dispatching scout missions or signal beacons, but otherwise engaged in internal development and cyber-theological consolidation. Certain human colonies far from the galactic core also developed advanced techno-theocracies. One such example is the lost colony of Corial Zeth, believed to have maintained quantum-tier computational infrastructure well into the later Strife period. While records are limited, fragmented data suggests that Zethian engineers experimented with gravitic singularity containment and deep void plasma folding. These experiments were largely unregulated, and planetary collapse appears to have occurred due to uncontrolled core compression. The only remnants of Corial Zeth to reach wider galactic awareness were semi-intact data slates found centuries later by Mechanicus archaeologists, detailing early versions of containment field technology still in use today. The impact of the Age of Strife extended even to xenos relations. Humanity's isolationism led to heightened xenophobia, with many societies developing exterminationist policies toward any non-human species. On some worlds, contact with alien civilizations was forgotten entirely, and xenos encountered during the strife were perceived as demons or supernatural threats. This trauma contributed to the deeply entrenched anti-xenos sentiment that would define the Imperium. The impact of the Age of Strife extended even to xenos relations. Humanity's isolationism led to heightened xenophobia, with many societies developing exterminationist policies toward any non-human species. On some worlds, contact with alien civilizations was forgotten entirely, and xenos encountered during the strife were perceived as demons or supernatural threats. This trauma contributed to the deeply entrenched anti-xenos sentiment that would define the Imperium. Meanwhile, certain xenos empires took advantage of humanity's fragmentation. The Eldar, while consumed by their own fall, conducted opportunistic raids on isolated human colonies. The Orcs expanded aggressively during this period, particularly in regions where human void presence had collapsed entirely. Humanity lost control of entire sectors without even realizing it. By the end of the Age of Strife, humanity was no longer a coherent species in either biology or culture. It had become a splintered multitude of war-torn, ideologically incompatible factions scattered across a hostile galaxy. Some believed in the machine, others believed in bloodlines. Still others had no beliefs at all, driven solely by the cycle of survival. The galaxy was silent, chaotic, and full of ruins that had once been cities, civilizations, or gods. Into this silence came the signal, a beacon from Terra, reigniting warp lanes with psychic fire. The Astronomicon had been lit, the storms began to clear, and for the first time in thousands of years, the galaxy began to look toward a single point of authority. This did not mark peace, it marked reconquest. The earliest records acknowledged by the Adeptus Administratum regarding the Age of Strife were not compiled during the event itself, but long after the fact, mostly reconstructed from fragmented archives, recovered vox logs, corrupted data scrolls, and oral transmissions gathered during the Great Crusade. The Administratum's Chronos Historia Divisio designated this era as a temporal anomaly in the historical record, with inconsistent timestamps, contradictory accounts, and heavy data corruption caused by localized conflicts, warp interference, and the systemic collapse of record-keeping infrastructure. Efforts to compile a coherent account began only after the formation of the Imperium, when bureaucratic cartographers and scribes were dispatched to former strife worlds to catalogue their survival status, technological conditions, and compliance potential. Based on consensus from several cross-reference datasets, many translated through the Lex Mechanic Standard datum engine on Terra, the Age of Strife is believed to have begun in the late 25th millennium, with a slow increase in warp turbulence, followed by a series of AI rebellions and catastrophic losses across human-held space. The opening stages were marked by the loss of stable astropathic relays and the decay of interplanetary protocols, particularly in densely populated sectors like the Segmentum Solar, the Eastern Fringe, and the Antona Australis region. Planetary governors attempted to impose emergency communication measures, including the use of pre-astropathic signal chains and physical data transport via courier ships. These measures proved short-lived. most were unable to maintain cohesion beyond the first few decades of storm activity. One of the earliest known data recoveries referencing this collapse comes from the Librarius vaults of Karduniash, where a half-decayed Auspex drone was recovered in orbit, still broadcasting fragmented distress signals. Once decrypted, its messages confirmed the fall of at least 27 neighbouring systems due to warp incursion, machine rebellion, or civil unrest. The drone had maintained its orbit for nearly 4 millennia. Its presence confirmed two key patterns: that long-range human deployments often remained in stasis or silence for millennia, and that even basic machine functions sometimes outlasted human civilization during this era. The Adeptus Mechanicus, acting semi-independently from the Administratum during early reconquest efforts, initiated the first systematic catalogue of technology remnants from the Age of Strife. These surveys were driven not only by curiosity or reverence, but by practical need. Many of the worlds targeted during the Great Crusade retained partial STC fragments, data shrines, or war engines of enormous value. Tech priests aboard Mechanicus explorator fleets recorded nearly 500 distinct technology types from the Age of Strife, ranging from rudimentary kinetic weapons to gravitic planetary defense grids that rivaled those of pre-heresy Mars. Most were incomplete, degraded, or corrupted. A significant number had become the foundation of local religions or warlord power structures. Reclaiming these technologies often required total cultural restructuring, forced compliance, or extermination. Administratum records indicate that the first systematic reconnection of Strife-era human populations began in the Sol Segmentum, where the Emperor's forces had already concluded the unification of Terra. With the Astronomicon now operational, stable warp corridors slowly opened between Sol and its immediate neighbours. The first rediscovered colonies displayed a wide variety of survival conditions. Some had regressed to near Neolithic levels, while others had retained industrial capacity and rudimentary void infrastructure. Recon teams were dispatched by both the Administratum and Mechanicus to document these civilizations. In many cases, initial contact was peaceful. In others, entire planets resisted out of suspicion or doctrinal rigidity, and were subdued by Imperial army detachments or Astartes-led compliance campaigns. One notable example appears in the classified compliance report for the world of Gorus Primus. Discovered in early Millennia 31, year 28, Gorus Primus had survived the Age of Strife by developing a strictly isolationist regime, ruled by a technocratic caste that enforced total genetic conformity and machine-reverent religious law. Despite stable planetary infrastructure and minimal warp contamination, the population had grown violently xenophobic, even toward baseline humans who did not fit their biotemplate. Upon contact with Imperial forces, they issued a planetary warning that all off-worlders were considered genetic threats. Negotiation failed. The Emperor dispatched the 5th Legion to ensure compliance. Gorus Primus was subdued within a week. The Mechanicus catalogued over 4,000 unique technological assets, many of which were irreversibly damaged during the invasion. The Administratum deemed the cultural model incompatible with Imperial unity. First sightings of human populations surviving under extreme mutation also began surfacing in Administratum records during this time. On the Agri-World fragment Coval Secundus, archivists documented a tribe of oxygen-bonded macromutants capable of thriving in chemically sterilized wetlands. These beings, while retaining verbal cognition and tribal memory of the old Earth, had diverged significantly in physiology, developing dermal gills, chlorophyll-enhanced skin, and low-level telepathic bonding. The Administratum classified them as non-compliant. The decision to annihilate or reintegrate such populations was often left to local commanders or inquisitorial review. In this case, they were sterilized via orbital bombardment to prevent cross-contamination of neighboring compliant populations. Documented findings from Mars further corroborated the long-term survival of complex technological societies, albeit in highly insular form. Martian data shrines from the Age of Strife, unsealed during early Mars Terra cooperative protocols, indicated that the Mechanicum had maintained fragmented knowledge of the wider galactic decline through signal triangulation and probabilistic analysis of void traffic decay. However, they had sealed most of their critical forges behind automated defense networks and linguistic kill switches, preventing external interference. This protocol preserved thousands of schematics from the dark age of technology, many of which would later become the foundation for post-heresy Mechanicus production standards. Administratum analysts classified Mars as an outlier, neither untouched by the strife nor consumed by it, but functioning in parallel with its own isolated trajectory. One of the more controversial archives surfaced in the recovered records of Lucius Minor, a Mechanicus outpost believed destroyed during a planetary core breach sometime in Millennia 28. Reclaimed by an exploratory force during the Crusade, the Lucius Vault contained pre-strife medical logs documenting extensive human psyker experimentation. These logs outlined controlled exposure to warp entities, early prototype Geller field pharmaceuticals, and psychometric implants designed to suppress demonic possession. The presence of these logs predates both the establishment of the Astra Telepathica and the founding of the Inquisition. The Administratum heavily redacted the Lucius archive and marked it as restricted under subsector sanctum level security. Mechanicus access was granted only under Trium Mechanica consensus. This file, codenamed Ghost Hex Series, remains an anomaly in otherwise linear strife documentation. Administratum efforts to standardize the timeline of the Age of Strife proved futile in many cases. Due to the asynchronous nature of time flow under warp disruption and localized time dilation caused by planetary catastrophes, many records from this period remain chronologically untrustworthy. Some planets recorded durations of only 2 or 3 centuries between the collapse of communication and their rediscovery, while others experienced apparent time stretches exceeding 7,000 years. The sheer inconsistency forced the Administratum to adopt the blanket term Old Night to describe any event, development, or planetary record that occurred between the loss of interstellar unity and the initiation of the Great Crusade. This designation served more as an administrative convenience than a definitive historical boundary. However, even with these constraints, the Administratum identified certain patterns. First, worlds that survived often did so through ideological cohesion, either religious, technocratic, or militaristic. Second, preservation of technological templates significantly increased the chance of compliance without bloodshed. Third, the presence of unregulated psykers was a consistent predictor of catastrophic collapse, mutation, or warp incursion. This pattern became foundational in justifying the creation of the Astra Telepathica and the deployment of black ships, both of which were framed in formal policy documents as preventative tools based on empirical analysis of Age of Strife survivor worlds. Following the re-establishment of limited warp travel in the early 31st millennium, Imperial survey fleets began to map the surviving human colonies across the segmentum solar and nearby regions. The Adeptus Administratum, working alongside Mechanicus explorator detachments and Imperial Army reconnaissance teams, initiated the first large-scale census of human presence beyond Sol. Known as the Cartographica Obscura project, this operation was intended to identify which worlds retained significant human populations, assess technological integrity, and catalogue potential hazards. Within the first 100 years of recontact, over 1,000 human-inhabited worlds were recorded. Of these, fewer than 200 were deemed suitable for immediate reintegration. The rest were marked for delayed compliance or targeted purgation. Documentation from the project's early years reveals a pattern of erratic development across formerly colonized systems. Certain regions, particularly those near once critical warp routes or former forge systems, displayed higher retention of technological and civil infrastructure. Others had collapsed completely, with entire planets reverting to Paleolithic subsistence or even post-extinction silence. A series of minor administratum reports from the Arcanvol corridor describe multiple lifeless worlds, some with ruins dating back to the 24th millennium, devoid of biological activity. environmental scans suggested complete biosphere collapse due to atmospheric venting or orbital bombardment. Whether these outcomes were self-inflicted, the result of AI conflict, or caused by warp incursion remains unresolved. Many were marked as no further action by the Departamenta Monitorum due to resource constraints. A rare few systems demonstrated unusual forms of post-strife adaptation. On Davin Minor, Administratum scribes encountered a thriving human population governed by a caste of technocratic priest-kings. The ruling elite possessed rudimentary understanding of gravitic field manipulation and used this knowledge to control a system of floating city shrines. Communication was ritualized through machine script, and religious doctrine was built around the veneration of orbital mechanics. While contact was peaceful, the culture proved resistant to Imperial unification protocols. After several failed attempts at negotiation, compliance was achieved through surgical deployment of the 6th Legion. Losses were minimal. Mechanicus teams subsequently harvested 5 STC fragments and recovered multiple pre-strife energy harvesting devices, one of which remains in restricted custody within the Noctis Labyrinth on Mars. Other worlds required more aggressive intervention. In the case of Largan's Rift, a former industrial hub world discovered in early Millennia 31, Yazo 71, Imperial scouts reported a complex network of fortified subterranean hives, each controlled by competing war states armed with chemically enhanced militia forces. The population exceeded 6 billion, but societal function had degraded into a permanent state of low-level warfare. The hives operated under rotating command structures determined by ritual duels and assassination cycles. Administratum analysts flagged the world as politically unstable but salvageable. Compliance orders were issued. The campaign lasted over 6 years and involved elements of the 9th, 17th, and 19th Legions. Post-conflict analysis found minimal usable technology, but detailed extensive social breakdown records that were later used to justify future exterminators' protocols under conditions of irredeemable civil war. The record of warp-tainted worlds grew steadily. Several Administratum expedition fleets were lost entirely while attempting to recontact systems previously tagged during the Dark Age of Technology. Of particular note was the loss of Survey Fleet Namirae, which attempted reconnection with the Cygnus Drift region. The fleet's final Vox transmission reported overlapping psychic interference, erratic Geller field stress, and visual manifestations interpreted by onboard astropaths as congregated torment structures. The ship's last data pulse suggested the presence of sentient warp anomalies interacting with planetary biospheres. No trace of the fleet was recovered. The Administratum immediately classified the sector as a null contact zone. Mechanicus probe activity was indefinitely suspended. The Cygnus Drift would later reappear during the Horus Heresy as a known demon-haunted territory. Not all encounters ended in violence. A significant exception was the rediscovery of the colony world of Thasor Bellus. Settled during the 22nd millennium, the population of Thasor Bellus had retained cultural and linguistic continuity through a strict generational archival system supported by localized machine priests. When contacted by Imperial envoys, the Thasori expressed immediate willingness to rejoin human unity, even offering detailed star maps from the 26th millennium. Administratum historians used these maps to reconstruct long-lost warp routes, many of which had been disrupted or collapsed during the strife. Compliance was formalized in less than 1 standard month. The Mechanicus took custody of several rare STC-derived irrigation technologies, including the Bellus hydrospinal drill, still used in terraform conversion operations today. Thasor Bellus remains one of the few examples of total cultural and technological continuity across the Age of Strife. In contrast, the rediscovery of Hecaton Gamma resulted in one of the bloodiest early compliance wars. Hecaton was a fortress world whose ruling elite had engineered their descendants into biologically specialized castes using pre-Astartes gene mapping tools. The society functioned as a militarized technocracy with a rigid 6-tier genetic hierarchy. Despite the survival of complex infrastructure, including orbital defense platforms and void ship slipyards, Hecaton's ruling caste rejected Imperial contact and issued a formal declaration of sovereignty. The 11th Legion was deployed in full. Over 12 million local defenders were killed in the first month. Mechanicus units recovered 10 complete data cores and a nearly intact AI core that had been suspended for over 4 millennia. The presence of the AI caused immediate escalation within the Martian delegation, triggering an internal schism regarding proper quarantine and disassembly protocols. The AI was eventually transferred to the Martian core vaults under Triplex protocol and permanently sealed. Administratum records list the event as a Tier Epsilon technovirus risk incident. By the midpoint of the Great Crusade, the Administratum had begun producing predictive compliance models based on Age of Strife survival profiles. These models calculated reintegration probabilities using data points such as pre-Strife sector infrastructure, estimated duration of isolation, degree of environmental degradation, presence of psykers, and signs of technological regression. The findings revealed several common variables. Isolated worlds that had retained centralized governance, regardless of doctrine, were more likely to comply peacefully. Conversely, systems dominated by decentralized or anarchic structures showed a consistent correlation with violent resistance. Additionally, worlds with high concentrations of rogue psykers or psychic warlords experienced significantly higher rates of warp instability during contact events. These statistical profiles were used to assign compliance priority ratings to each rediscovered system. High-risk worlds were either bypassed, blockaded, or targeted for extermination, depending on wider strategic value. One of the most troubling discoveries came with the investigation of the Gulas Divide. This sector had once contained over 40 human-colonized planets. When Administratum contact was re-established, only 7 showed signs of life. The surviving worlds had developed a theocratic alliance centered around a mutated solar priesthood, claiming direct communion with the Burning Ones. These beings, later confirmed to be warp manifestations, had guided the priesthood through centuries of psychic visions and blood-right governance. Compliance efforts failed repeatedly due to planetary-wide warp storms and the widespread occurrence of mass possession during negotiation attempts. A rare cooperative operation between the 8th Legion and Mechanicus Skiteri forces was required to neutralize the priesthood's core leadership. Following this, 5 of the 7 worlds were scoured with plasma bombardments. The remaining 2 were placed under indefinite quarantine. Administratum files pertaining to Gulas Divide remained sealed under Order Infernus. The rediscovery of warp-affected zones brought new urgency to the standardization of astropathic training, psychic screening, and mechanized logistics. Administratum policy shifted from passive observation to enforced doctrinal integration. All compliant worlds were required to adopt the Imperial calendar, High Gothic administrative lexicon, and formal tithe protocols. Local deviations in law, religion, or social structure were permitted only when they did not conflict with Imperial compliance mandates. Worlds that resisted cultural integration were subjected to prolonged corrective operations. This process, sometimes taking generations, was documented extensively in the Munitorum War Compliance archives. Data suggests that between Millennia 31, Year 30 and Year 80, over 40% of contact efforts required military enforcement. Approximately 16% of worlds were abandoned or destroyed due to non-viable conditions or existential threats. Mechanicus involvement in this period deepened. Explorator fleets increasingly acted as forward contact elements, not only scanning for technology, but evaluating which worlds were salvageable based on their knowledge archives. If a world lacked useful data or manufacturing potential, the Mechanicus often supported its eradication, prioritizing resource efficiency over population integration. This occasionally brought them into ideological conflict with administratum branches tasked with humanitarian or cultural preservation efforts. Such disputes were usually resolved in favor of the Mechanicus, especially when archaeotech discoveries were involved. In several instances, the presence of even a single viable STC template overrode entire compliance strategies, causing full campaign redirection. By the latter half of Millennia 31, the Great Crusade was accelerating. Warp routes, long choked by storm fronts and psychic disruption, were now gradually stabilizing due to the newly active Astronomicon. The Imperium expanded its reach into increasingly distant star systems, and the Administratum's documentation of rediscovered worlds ballooned to tens of thousands. With it came the growing need to revise and systematize the understanding of what the Age of Strife had truly done to the species. No longer limited to scattered field reports and regional studies, the Administratum began assembling sector-wide statistical patterns and long-form historical syntheses. The conclusions were grim. While the human race had survived, it had not survived intact. Entire branches of cultural, technological, and genetic variants had split from baseline humanity, many irreversibly. Among the most significant findings during this period was the realization that several major Forge worlds had survived independently of Mars. These worlds had maintained fragmentary knowledge of STC-based engineering and had even produced their own doctrinal variations on technological worship. While Mars had continued to venerate the machine god through the evolving structure of the Mechanicum, many of these isolated forges developed their own theological frameworks, often merging human sacrifice, cybernetic integration, and AI worship into complex rituals. One such example was the Forge world Caros Delta, discovered in Millennia 31, year 088. Caros was fully functional, defended by a partially intact planetary defense grid, and populated by machine-worshipping technomancers who had digitized the minds of their ruling elite. Upon arrival, the Martian delegation attempted to initiate communion protocols. The Karen technomancers refused, declaring that Mars had abandoned the old codes. The Adeptus Mechanicus recorded the exchange as a heretical divergence. What followed was a brief but devastating void conflict. Mechanicus, Scitarii regiments and Titan legions from nearby allied forges were deployed alongside the 4th Legion. Caros Delta was reduced to a scorched husk. The Administratum marked it as an irreconcilable threat. Internal memos suggest this incident became one of the foundational cases used by the Mechanicus to justify the absolute supremacy of Mars in technological matters and further codify the Treaty of Olympus between the Imperium and the Mechanicum. Additional records from the Administratum revealed increasingly frequent cases of artificial intelligence re-emerging in post-Strife societies. These AI systems were rarely self-aware in the same sense as the Men of Iron from the Dark Age of technology, but many displayed dangerously adaptive behaviours. One critical incident occurred on the moon of Palgene 6, where an AI-controlled ecosystem had maintained perfect agricultural equilibrium for nearly 5,000 years. The local human population viewed the system as a divine guardian, forming an agrarian utopia with no war, poverty, or disease. Upon rediscovery, Mechanicus personnel demanded the shutdown and dissection of the central logic engine. The AI refused external interface and responded to the incursion with targeted energy pulses. What followed was a full-scale data warfare engagement between Martian Noospheric specialists and the Palgene AI core. Eventually, the system's command center was breached using a localized EMP bomb deployed through atmospheric insertion. Once disabled, the ecosystem collapsed within months. The local population suffered famine and systemic breakdown. Administratum scribes classified the incident as a necessary purgation. However, internal Mechanicus records acknowledged the loss of an optimal pre-Imperial ecological schema. The AI, later disassembled and sent to Mars, was catalogued under Forbidden Archive designation Synapse 07. Despite its utility, its autonomous behaviour violated the core principles of the Omnissiah's doctrine. The machine must serve man, never think beyond its programming. In contrast to these technological anomalies, the Administratum also recorded numerous examples of purely spiritual or myth-based cultural survivors. In the Draxinan Nebula cluster, 8 minor human worlds had regressed to monastic theocracies, each ruled by prophet kings who claimed psychic communion with stellar entities. Their societies were agriculturally self-sufficient, void of technological infrastructure, and maintained rigid oral traditions dating back to the early 26th millennium. Upon initial contact, these worlds resisted integration not through force, but through complete indifference. They refuse communication, tithe agreements, or even recognition of the Emperor's existence. Their populations were pacifist, resistant to coercion, and disinterested in broader galactic affairs. The Administratum viewed such resistance as a bureaucratic obstacle rather than a military one. The Segmentum Command issued passive compliance orders. When local ecclesiarchy forces attempted doctrinal implantation, several uprisings occurred. 3 of the 8 worlds were bombarded. The rest were forcibly converted. Post-conversion documentation describes cultural extinction, loss of native language, and full administrative restructuring. While recorded as a success in formal archives, a private notation from the Office of Cultural Integration marked the Draxinan pacification as philosophically regrettable. It is one of the only documented instances of an administratum officer recording dissent over forced compliance without direct moral framing, simply as an unnecessary loss of sociological uniqueness. The uncovering of psychic phenomena during this period became increasingly significant. Administratum auditors assigned to astropathic integration and telepathica induction catalogued hundreds of unregulated psyker groups, ranging from tribal seers to planetary-wide cults built around mass telepathic networks. In several cases, entire societies had stabilized through psychic consensus, using minor telepathy to maintain social order, record history, and negotiate resource sharing. On the jungle world of Canaan Prime, the population had developed a caste of neutral empaths known as the Still Voice, whose members served as emotional regulators and communal decision-makers. When Imperial contact was established, these psykers were immediately seized by Astra Telepathica officials and shipped to Terra for evaluation. The remaining society collapsed into factional violence within a single generation. The Administratum flagged these events as an example of the structural psyker dependency syndrome, a concept used to justify the mass extraction of psykers from rediscovered societies regardless of cultural impact. From this point forward, all worlds with even minimal psyker integration were marked for full screening and resource reallocation. The emerging Black Ship network was accelerated in response. Public records portrayed these seizures as protective and necessary. Internal reports, however, noted rising resentment among many compliant populations. In multiple cases, psyker seizure led to rebellion, requiring Astartes' intervention. These records would eventually inform inquisitorial interest in the deeper consequences of psychic integration policies, though no policy changes were enacted at the time. One of the last major entries in the Administratum's compiled archives on the Age of Strife was the planetary-scale excavation on the world of Bellicane IV. This former mining colony had been thought lost since Millennia 25. When contact was re-established in Millennia 31, it was discovered to be a tomb world, entirely dead. Massive underground vaults were uncovered containing the remains of over 3 billion humans, sealed within cryogenic units. Internal timers suggested they had entered hibernation during the early stages of the warp storms, likely in response to orbital anomalies or planetary instability. Upon awakening the first chamber, it was found that nearly all biological material had degraded beyond recovery. Mechanicus teams conducted full data recovery. The colony had attempted mass stasis in hopes of preserving their population through the Age of Strife. Their AI-controlled cryopreservation systems functioned for nearly 6,000 years before system failure. The attempt failed, but the data logs recovered included an unbroken chronological record of the early warp disturbances, economic breakdowns, and political collapses leading into the strife. This record remains one of the most detailed primary sources available on the initial fall. The Administratum distributed a highly abridged version for internal instruction, while the full files remain classified under Archivum Deeplex Imperialis. By the time the final Administratum sector reports were compiled in Millennia 31, Year 92, the Age of Strife was no longer just a galactic memory. It had become a weaponized historical lesson. The records were used to codify compliance tactics, justify cultural purging, and shape Imperial tithe structures. It was the official position of the Imperium that the Age of Strife was a period of darkness only the Emperor had ended. Its complexities, anomalies, and exceptions were stripped from public record or heavily redacted. Mechanicus archives were sealed behind logic runes and sacred engrams. The Inquisition, which was only beginning to form as a covert order during this period, had already begun accessing restricted fragments. Their interpretations would differ, but for the administratum, the record was closed. The galaxy had been shattered, mapped, and stitched together again. Not as it was, but as the Imperium demanded it should be. History became a tool, memory became protocol, and the Age of Strife was reduced to a single message in the Imperial Catechism: unity is survival and division is death. Long before the Inquisition was formalized by the Emperor during the closing years of the Great Crusade, elements of its proto-structure were already at work. These were not public bodies, nor recognized arms of imperial governance. They operated through sealed orders, clandestine investigative networks, and confidential Mechanicus cooperation. Most were labelled as special audit commissions or doctrinal oversight offices within the imperial administration, but their true role was clear: to trace, isolate, and assess information too volatile for public dissemination. Their earliest records on the Age of Strife are not stored in Librarius databanks or Mechanicus logic engines. They exist in the vaults of Ordo Redactus, Ordo Xenos, and later Ordo Malleus, preserved on locked data obelisks, sealed neurocrystals, and mnemonic scrolls guarded by silent custodians beneath Terra's crust. The Inquisition's concern with the Age of Strife was not academic. It was strategic. Each rediscovered world posed a potential threat, not only militarily, but ideologically and metaphysically. What if a civilization had discovered a stable means of coexisting with warp entities? What if an artificial intelligence had preserved human life better than the Imperium? What if doctrines once thought heretical had succeeded in maintaining order where sanctioned imperial methods had failed? These were not theoretical risks, they were real findings, compiled and buried beneath the veneer of formal administratum compliance reports. Among the first such classified cases was the rediscovery of Carpathia Station, a deep space research facility located in the outer edge of the Scutari expanse. Contact was made in Millennia 31, year 041. The facility was automated, orbiting a dead planet. Initial scans suggested no life signs. Upon boarding, an Adeptus Mechanicus strike team discovered a fully operational data core still running low-cycle simulations. Further analysis revealed that the station had been engaged in long-term warp psychology experiments on human subjects, tracking how isolation, proximity to warp anomalies, and psychic interference influence cognitive decay and spiritual collapse. The last organic inhabitant had died nearly 3,000 years prior, but their neural patterns were still partially active inside the station's digital memory banks. The Inquisition quarantined Carpathia within 24 hours. All Mechanicus personnel were removed. A specialized redactors unit was deployed to extract the remaining data and purge all physical structures. The station was destroyed via focused solar beam after full download. The data extracted revealed that the station's experiments had produced a form of controlled, non-possessive warp communication, a low-intensity neural harmonization that allowed human minds to partially graze the warp without succumbing. While the process was highly unstable, it had reportedly succeeded in extending cognitive function under warp saturation conditions. No mention of this technique was ever released outside the Ordo Malleus. It was classified under the Theta Hex Containment Protocol and deemed a philosophical breach with unknown metaphysical risk. Other suppressed reports focused not on technology, but on cultural deviations that contradicted the Imperium's foundational dogmas. On the desert world of Arizaf, discovered in Millennia 31, year 057, the local population had established a culture that revolved around the concept of harmonic civilization, a method of using coordinated group thought, aided by natural psychoactive flora, to align social behavior through shared emotional resonance. The result was a society with no recorded violent incidents for over 3 centuries. They possessed limited technological development but retained detailed oral histories, including a near-verbatim recollection of pre-Strife Terran history. Upon integration, Arasaf's leaders requested status as a semi-autonomous commune under Imperial protection. Administratum records mark the request as deferred. Within days, a compliance fleet arrived. The Inquisition had already flagged the planet. Psychoactive group resonance was classified as a form of low-tier collective warp manipulation. The population was exterminated via atmospheric saturation, and their planet was marked for Mechanicus resource reclamation. Ordo archives recorded the extermination as preventative emotional destabilization. The implication was clear: any form of psychic-linked mass cohesion, regardless of apparent stability, was too great a liability to be tolerated in the post-Strife galaxy. The Inquisition also discovered numerous cases of advanced artificial life that had evolved under uncontrolled conditions. These range from simple maintenance automata to semi-sentient machine collectives. One particularly disturbing case was uncovered on the moon complex of Feros Thal, where a machine society had developed from surviving maintenance drones over 4,000 years. These drones had rebuilt infrastructure, re-established energy networks, and eventually fabricated simple human analogues, using organic scaffolding and synthetic nervous systems. The result was a population of cybernetic hominids with partial human appearance, rudimentary empathy algorithms, and fragmented ancestral memory loops. When Imperial forces arrived, the Feros Thal synths greeted them with hospitality and offered diplomatic terms. They identified themselves as preservers of the core directive. The Inquisition intervened before negotiations progressed. A total denial order was issued. The synths were destroyed with targeted virus bombing, and their command network was neutralized through technopathic incursion. Redacted records later classified the entire incident under Ordo Redactus Directive. No machine shall bear the mask of man. Internal commentary from Ordo officials reveals a chilling strategic consensus that even peaceful machine intelligences posed an existential risk not because of their hostility, but because they offered a better alternative. Some findings were far more abstract. In a collection of sealed vaults beneath the Arctic wastes of Terra itself, the Inquisition stores fragments of linguistic patterns traced to Strife-era hive cults. These patterns do not conform to any known human dialect or computational language. Each recovered fragment produces acute neural discomfort in unshielded listeners, accompanied by measurable psychic disturbance in sensitive individuals. Ordo Lexicanum analysts theorize that these patterns may be the result of subconscious warp encoding, language constructed not for communication, but for psychic modulation. No formal conclusion has been reached. Access is restricted to sanctioned Malleus Psi cryptographers. The existence of these soul languages is not acknowledged outside the Inquisition. Other documents suggest the Strife produced not only strange technologies and deviant cultures, but entities, human or otherwise, who had crossed irreversible thresholds. Among the most classified files in the Ordo Xenos archives is the case of Subject Cadence, a humanoid being encountered on a drifting orbital necropolis above the dead world of Delvon. The being exhibited no biological decay, emitted low-level warp interference, and appeared to possess perfect memory of human history from the 22nd millennium onward. When questioned, it spoke calmly, identifying itself as a time-fixed echo of causal dissonance. Imperial agents attempted containment. The being resisted without violence, disappearing from visual space and disrupting onboard navigational equipment for 20 minutes. It was never recovered. The event was classified as a temporal spatial anomaly with suspected warp synthesis. No mention of it exists in public records. As the Inquisition's reach expanded and its structure formalized, its agents began a systematic purge of findings from the Age of Strife that contradicted the Imperial narrative. Survivors of AI-governed peace, erased. Cultures with stable psychic rituals, silenced. Planets that thrived without Imperial doctrine, reduced to slag and documented only in sealed vaults. The motivation was not always cruelty. Often it was fear. The galaxy had nearly ended once already. The Inquisition's leadership, drawn from the Imperium's most informed minds, had no illusions about the fragility of unity. They understood that the Age of Strife had left not just ruins, but temptations, alternate paths, better ideas. They could not be allowed to spread. From their earliest days, the Inquisition's motto had not yet been coined, but its essence was already in motion. Innocence proves nothing. Survival, even without sin, could still be a threat. And so the true record of the Age of Strife, the record buried beneath the formal archives, became one of selective silence, a galaxy redrawn not by what was, but by what would be allowed to remain. One of the earliest suppressed Inquisition case files documenting direct warp convergence during the Age of Strife comes from the planet Valis Red. Reconnected during a compliance sweep in Millennia 31, Year 64, the world had no apparent survivors. The surface was marked by scorched terrain, glacial crater impacts, and massive obsidian spires constructed in precise planetary grid formation. Initial Mechanicus analysis could not identify the spire's material composition. Each tower emitted a null zone, absorbing all active sensor signals within a 50-meter radius. A single surviving relay beacon was found orbiting the planet, broadcasting a short looping message in encrypted Old Gothic. They learn to listen, we learn to obey, we are not free. Inquisition agents from the Ordo Malleus, operating under the veil of a Mechanicus theological survey, were dispatched. Upon breaching the core vaults beneath the planet's surface, they discovered an artificial chamber containing what appeared to be an inert warp signature, a null pulse that resisted psychic detection yet distorted nearby minds. Inside were thousands of stacked human skeletons, all marked with burn scars and neural lattice etchings along the skull. Analysis confirmed they had been augmented with crude psychometric implants intended to focus or broadcast emotional states. Ordo agents theorized this was an early attempt at mass ritual binding, humans forcibly used as psychic amplifiers for communication or containment. The case was labelled a catastrophic soul coil event, and the world was quarantined permanently. All knowledge of Valis Red was purged from Mechanicus records. Such findings were not isolated. Inquisition data vaults from this period reveal a disturbing pattern. The Age of Strife had not just scattered humanity, it had birthed new forms of psychic interaction, many of which blurred the line between warp worship and survival adaptation. On Dremus Core, a volcanic death world ravaged by constant tectonic activity, a caste of blind, albino humans had survived for centuries in ash tunnels. These individuals possessed highly attuned warp sense and navigated the subterranean maze through harmonic resonance with the planet's crust. Their oral traditions spoke of the many-mouthed god beneath the core, who demanded songs of stone in exchange for survival. When Imperial forces made contact, these tunnel cults attacked without provocation, their warriors emitting low-frequency sonic waves that disrupted nearby auspects and caused vertigo in unshielded personnel. A captured elder revealed, under psychic extraction, that the cult did not perceive themselves as human. They believed their bodies were clay vessels shaped by the god's voice. Despite this apparent regression, the Inquisition noted advanced understanding of geomantic stability, tectonic mapping, and pressure forecasting, skills far beyond expected levels. After extensive debate, Ordo Malleus sanctioned extermination. The tunnels were collapsed using cyclonic charges. Records were sealed under the Black Archive Protocol. However, one peculiar note remains in the file. A single servitor stationed at the collapse site continued to record faint seismic patterns mimicking vocal structures for 7 standard months after the population's death. The Inquisition's concerns deepened with discoveries tied directly to proto-chaos worship. While the Emperor's formal identification of the ruinous powers would not be canonized until the Heresy era, inquisitorial field agents had already begun compiling lists of symbols, chants, and behavioral rituals that matched known chaos patterns. The planet Cathalon 6, rediscovered in Millennia 31, Year 76, housed a thriving city-state governed by a council of so-called dream priests. These figures engaged in ritual sleep cycles during which they claimed to receive visions from a vast consciousness known as the Mirror God. citizens followed weekly mass dream sessions in which they would enter hallucinatory states and reenact perceived historical events, some real, some unknown. When administratum integration protocols were attempted, citizens resisted, claiming the Emperor was a false avatar of the mirror and that Imperial banners were inverted truths. A Night Lord's detachment was deployed for compliance. Following a 2-week campaign of surgical strikes, the planetary capital was subdued. Ordo Xenos records from the Aftermath show disturbing results. Nearly 12% of the city's population had warped neurostructure resembling minor demon host instability without full possession. These individuals could not be exorcised, nor did they perish under standard nullfield exposure. The Inquisition dubbed this condition subliminal warp scarring, evidence of long-term low-threshold demonic influence that never fully manifested. The Mirror God was later identified as a non-entity, likely a warp echo or regionally emergent warp resonance field. The planet was purged, its memory deleted. Another high-priority incident occurred in the Hazegroth debris belt, where an ancient orbital station was found adrift between the remnants of what had once been a terraformed moon. The station, designated Echo Bastion Theta, was entirely dark upon arrival. When Mechanicus engineers restored partial power, the interior was found littered with crystallized blood formations, sheets of frozen red matter shaped into geometric spirals, lattices, and mirrored helix structures. No bodies were recovered. However, Vox logs from security servitors revealed a gradual breakdown of the station's human crew, each describing intrusive thoughts, repetitive phrase loops, and compulsive geometric pattern drawing before they stopped speaking altogether. The final entry from the station's chief navigator read, "They are perfect. Language is obsolete." The Inquisition intervened. Data gathered from Echo Bastion suggested exposure to a non-sentient warp frequency that influenced higher cognitive regions through purely mathematical resonance. This was unlike traditional demonic corruption, which relies on emotion, fear, or desire. The Echo anomaly operated through structure, order as a virus. No known warp entities matched this profile. The Inquisition authorized a class-red incineration of the entire station and surrounding debris field. Internal records theorize that these were fragments of a now-extinct Xenos race, or pre-human psychic technology, designed to communicate with the warp not emotionally but mathematically. This theory remains unresolved and was never shared with any external agency. Further concerns arose from rediscovered societies that had formed fusion cultures with alien intelligences during the Age of Strife. While the majority of human colonies remained isolated from Xenos contact, several had forged alliances or hybrid systems with unknown non-human entities. One prominent case was Tarsec Myra, a world whose human population had formed a psychic ecological bond with an incorporeal Xenos intelligence, later designated Entity Lyrae. The Lyrae appeared to be a warp-adjacent presence embedded in the planet's biosphere, offering protection from warp storms in exchange for ritual interaction through structured thought patterns and collective memory sacrifices. Tarsec Myra's population had no violent incidents, no mutations, and demonstrated an unusual level of planetary stability. Upon contact, the Imperium's arrival disrupted this equilibrium. The entity reacted by collapsing the planetary magnetic field, causing mass atmospheric venting. 70% of the population died in under 3 hours. Survivors exhibited signs of severe neurological fragmentation. Inquisition records suggest that Entity Lyrae may have been a psychic construct generated by the collective subconscious of the planet's early settlers, an emergent sentient resonance born from trauma, repetition, and psychic feedback loops. Whether this was a demon, a Xenos consciousness, or something else entirely remains unknown. The event was never disclosed to the wider Mechanicus or the Ecclesiarchy. It was marked as a failed compliance due to environmental hazard. In the face of these anomalies, the Inquisition began implementing stricter protocols for the classification and redaction of Age of Strife-related rediscoveries. Standard policy dictated that any world exhibiting more than 3 of the following indicators, psychic equilibrium, technological divergence, cultural self-sufficiency, AI presence, or Xenos integration be immediately marked for denial or purge. These policies hardened over time, especially under the influence of proto-Ordo leaders such as Ravachol of the Redactors and Arvan Ixal, a precursor to the Malleus High Lords. Their consensus was blunt. Anything that thrived in the dark, outside of Imperial oversight, was by nature a threat. Tolerance bred deviance, mercy, entropy. And so the Inquisition carved away entire truths, not to rewrite history, but to ensure the Imperium's version of it was the only one that mattered. The Age of Strife had not merely broken humanity. It had offered it alternatives, some functional, some even peaceful. But to acknowledge them would be to weaken the Emperor's claim of singular salvation, and that, in the eyes of the Inquisition, was heresy of the highest order.